Welcome everyone to Chat with a Diplomat. This is an initiative by the American Consulate General in Sydney to connect young Queensland and New South Wales students with senior American diplomats. It's designed to be a frank and open discussion about anything between Australia and the United States, whether it be foreign policy or culture or economic. It's also supported by the Ben Franklin Club, which is a youth networking group for students and young people interested in US politics and affairs, which is sponsored by the US Consulate General in Sydney. I'm Liam Jarman from the Griffith University Government and International Relations Society, the Gold Coast campus. We try to host events we believe our members may be interested in, and I'm grateful to have this opportunity to have you all with me here tonight. Just for some housekeeping, everyone's automatically on mute, and we'll first go through some pre-submitted questions after we hear from all of our attendees, and then we'll turn it over to the audience where I'll allow you to be unmuted and you can ask your questions. But we would prefer if you could keep those short and sweet so we can get through as many people as possible. Without further ado, I'll go around the panelists now and we'll give them a brief opportunity to tell them a bit about ourselves. Donald?
Okay, I'll kick off. Hi, everyone. My name is Donald Maynard. I am the head of public affairs at the U.S. Consulate here in Sydney, Australia. Been in Australia a little bit over 2 years. My previous postings with the State Department have been in Brazil. I served in Baghdad 2 different times, in 2008 and 2013, in London, in New Delhi, and right before I came to Australia, I was at our permanent delegation to UNESCO in Paris. Before I joined the State Department, I worked on the other side of the tracks. I worked for civil society organizations for about 15, 20 years before I joined the State Department. Elizabeth?
Thanks, Donald. Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Rudisell. I'm originally from Charlotte, North Carolina. Joined the State Department about 11 years ago. I've been posted in the U.S. Embassy in Seoul, U.S. Embassy and Consulate in Mexico, the U.S. Embassy in Cuba, and I've been here in Sydney for about 2 years. My job here is Chief of American Citizen Services. Means we help Americans with passports and reports of birth and death and visit them in prison and all sorts of things. And I'm excited to answer some questions from you all today and hear from you. Lincoln?
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Liam. My name is Lincoln Frazier. I am Vice Consul here at the U.S. Consulate in Sydney. I know this is a chat with senior diplomats. Sorry to disappoint you. I don't actually fit that bill. I am a junior diplomat. I've been in the Foreign Service as a diplomat for about 5 years. Previous to serving in Sydney as Vice Consul, I was in the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where I worked as a Deputy Press Attaché, Deputy Spokesperson. Here in Sydney, as Vice Consul, I work primarily in visa adjudication. So all of you looking for visas to go study in the USA, things like that, or to go visit the USA as a tourist. You're talking to people like me. Prior to my time in the Foreign Service, I worked primarily in the nonprofit and NGO sector. I spent about 5 years in Bulgaria working in development in one way or another. I spent some time in Haiti working in development prior to basically joining the Foreign Service. So I'm thrilled to be here today. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Well, thank you for those introductions. We'll start off with some pre-submitted questions. I'll start with Donald. What's it like working as a diplomat and what career opportunities are there?
Okay, yeah, good question. And what I have found is that there is no one specific answer to what it's like being a diplomat. Now, I can speak to my own experience, and I also would like to highlight that the different diplomatic corps around the world operate a little bit differently. So I can talk about how the American Foreign Service works. First of all, it's the best job I've ever had in my life. I am somebody who, from a young age, loved to read every newspaper I could lay my hands on. And it's really nice to have a job where actually I'm paid to read the newspapers and to know what's going on and to think about what's going on. The other amazing thing about the job is the opportunity to travel. You've heard from all of us, we've served pretty much right around the globe. It's a remarkable opportunity to go and not just visit places, but live there for a few years. Our foreign service, like many, also teaches languages. I have been taught, I won't say I'll learn, but I've been taught both French and Portuguese, and that becomes part of your job if you take a posting in a country where you need the language. We have a Foreign Service Institute near Washington where they teach something like 80, 90 languages. So the job is amazing. It can be frustrating. You know, you come in and you think you're going to change the world, just like when I worked in nonprofits, I thought it was going to change the world. And you find out that you're part of a big bureaucracy. But it is remarkable. You know, you do have the opportunity to influence policy, even at my fairly junior level. You have the opportunity to feed information up through the system. And it's not always pretty watching how policy is developed. But I would say the career, very, very fulfilling, not always a walk in the park, but no job is.
Thank you for that answer. Next, I'll pass one over to Elizabeth. How did you get into diplomacy and how do you go about becoming a diplomat?
Thanks, Liam. Again, like Donald's answer, this is going to be about the U.S. Foreign Service. I know that there are some international organizations like you can work directly for the UN and the World Bank and things, but then each country is going to have its own path for diplomats. In the U.S., we have a really, really interesting hiring system. You have to take a written exam, score pretty highly on that, and if you pass that, you're invited to an in-person exam with where you're tested with a number of other people who are applying and do some virtual meetings and write memos and things like that. And if you pass that, then you're able to be hired into the Foreign Service. That's assuming you get your security clearance and your medical clearance as well. And we have an interesting system because it is open to anybody who's a US citizen, at least 18 years old. You don't need to have any kind of special degree or anything. And I think that's led to the US Foreign Service. We have a very wide variety of people with a wide variety of backgrounds. I have colleagues who were attorneys before, who have PhDs in neurology or comparative religion. And it means that our colleagues are a really interesting bunch and bring a lot to the table and a lot to the service.
Thank you for that one. Lincoln, what experience has shaped your career the most? Big one.
That's a tough one. I guess prior to joining the Foreign Service, what really led me down this path, I would suppose, would be I was at an Irish pub in Sofia, Bulgaria, and I met a couple of American diplomats there, and I got to chatting with these diplomats, and they really sort of sold me on the idea that it is possible to have a pretty spectacular job, just as Donald had discussed his passion for it, doing something good for and trying to influence policy in a positive fashion, as well as being able to live the life of a career diplomat. So living abroad, experiencing other cultures, and it was really that time when I was in Sofia, Bulgaria, that I said, all right, this is going to be the career for me. As far as an experience specifically while in the Foreign Service, that really sort of, really highlighted the importance of the job. It would have been when I was in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and we had a situation which at the time it was President Barack Obama had to come to Saudi Arabia for a series of meetings. And I got to participate in this visit at the very highest level. And here I was, I'd probably been in the Foreign Service as a diplomat for maybe a year and a half. And I was being entrusted with the responsibility of helping to facilitate a successful visit of the president of my country on these very important bilateral discussions. And that made me think, okay, yeah, I may not have the pedigree or the background or the education of some of my colleagues, but here I am, and I'm still doing it, and it was a successful visit, and it was really, really something to energize me further with the career.
Thank you. These next few I'll put to anyone who wants to take them up. What do you know? Sorry, what do you do when your personal beliefs are contradicted by a government policy?
This is where you all get to watch each of us sort of look off in the other direction for the other one. I'll go ahead and kick in here, and then please, Lincoln and Elizabeth, if you want to chime in. And this is one of the questions that comes up in almost every engagement that I've had here and in the other countries where I've worked. I have served now 3 different presidents, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and now President Trump. And I can guarantee you that not one of my colleagues across the Foreign Service who has been in for more than 4 years has agreed with every single policy move of every president that they've served. We swear an oath when we join the Foreign Service. It's actually a very chilling sort of moment. It's your first day of your orientation class, and they don't warn you that we're going to have you all raise your hand and swear an oath. They explain later that they're not allowed to pay us until we swear the oath, and so they knock it out the first day. But our oath is to the Constitution of the United States. Constitution sets up the rules about how our leadership is elected, and we work for the executive branch. So it's our job to deliver on the policies of the executive branch of the United States government. There have been times when I have been 180 degrees away from a decision or a policy of the government, and I can do that all I want when I'm at home. But when I'm working, it's my job to deliver on the policy of the United States. So what we do is we deliver on the policies that come through, and if we disagree with something, and it's something that's very near and dear to us, an issue that we really believe strongly about, we have the opportunity to feed up through our chain of command our disagreement with that policy. And in fact, since the 1970s, there's been an official process called the dissent channel, where any Foreign Service officer anywhere in the world can write a cable. Cable is just old school for our official communications back to the United States. They used to literally be teletype sort of cables. We still call them that. Now they look and feel like an email. So you can author a cable that will go right past your boss, right past your boss's boss, and about 20 different levels, and go straight to the Director General of the Foreign Service, who is a career person, not a political appointee. And then they have to respond to you and anybody else who's co-signed the dissent cable, and respond to your argument as to why this policy or this act of the government is wrong. There are so many famous dissent cables that have been leaked to the press. There's many more that happen privately and are dealt with inside of the department. And you as an employee are protected through the dissent cable channel. There can't be any reprisals against you. You can't be fired or given a lousy job. And then our final option, if we disagree with our government, is to turn in our papers and go find another job. So that, and some people do choose to do that on occasion. It's happened as recently as the last couple of years. It happened in 2003 when we went into Iraq. It happened during the Vietnam War. There's been a variety of times in our history when some of my colleagues have decided to step away. Elizabeth or Lincoln, anything you want to add?
Go ahead, Lincoln.
I'll just add really quickly. What's that, Elizabeth? Did you have something, Elizabeth?
Go ahead.
Okay. Just to add to that, just really quick, one other thing is, in these positions, there's also some opportunity to help influence the policy that's put forth as far as foreign policy is concerned, also with sharing information back to DC and things like that. So I just want to throw that out there too.
Elizabeth, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I'll just add a note. We have a law in the United States called the Hatch Act. And what that means is no federal government employee whether that's somebody who works for the Social Security Administration or the IRS or the State Department, is allowed to participate in partisan political activity while they're on the job. So that applies to everybody in the federal workforce. The difference for us as diplomats is that when we're overseas, we are always at work. You know, when I leave the office, it's not like, "Whoa, I'm not a diplomat anymore. I'm just here." Nope, like I'm on all the time. And so it is a little bit different than other workers with the federal government in terms of, you know, you can have your own opinions, but you can't always keep them, you can't always put them out there in public. But as Donald said, and as Lincoln said, there are options for making your voice heard. And you can definitely do that through the dissent channel, through the policy creation process. And as Donald said, your last resort is if you really don't agree with what's going on and you feel like you haven't been able to change it and you can't do that work anymore, you can always quit.
Great, thank you. For our next one, how do you see the Australian-US alliance in the future? Does anyone have any views on that one?
All right, I'll go first here, but I'm not going to go first on all of them. So, okay, so the future of the alliance. First of all, the alliance between the United States and Australia is exceptionally strong. At the government-to-government level, there is very little that we disagree with each other on. We may disagree on the margins of some issues, but for the vast majority of policy issues, Australia and the United States are in very close alignment. And I don't see any reason why our alliance would become any weaker in the foreseeable future. I know that the United States through, here I'm not just talking about the military alliance, I'm talking about the economic relationship between our two countries, the social cultural relationship between our two countries. You know, I hear more American accents walking around Sydney than most other foreign accents. I have a hard time walking 10 feet down the street without seeing a LA Lakers cap or a New York Yankees cap or you know, other American brands around. But our military alliance is as close as could be. Lincoln and I had the good fun of standing on the deck of the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier last year when it visited Brisbane as part of the Talisman Sabre military exercises, where we have something like 35,000 personnel between the two countries, cross-training all through the Coral Sea and up in Townsville and some other places up and down your Queensland coast. So that military alliance is as close as could be. We cross-train, we have embeds in your military, you have Australian Defence Forces embedded in our military. On the economic side, the United States is the #1 economic partner with Australia. We're the #1 provider of foreign direct investment. Not for release yet, but there's a couple of medical companies here that are getting ready to announce expanding their business and providing more jobs for Australians. So we have tons and tons of connections. Boeing, the aircraft manufacturer, only develops new aircraft in the United States with one exception. And that one exception is here in Australia, where Boeing is developing a new aircraft from the ground up using Australian engineers and technicians to develop this aircraft. So I think we're just going to go from strength to strength in terms of the alliance.
That was a great response. If anyone wanted to add anything to that one? No? Yeah. Well, either for Lincoln or Elizabeth, because Donald just took that last one. What are the roles of a diplomat? I know that might seem like a very simple question, but I feel like we could be here all night just talking about that one alone.
Well, I would just like to suggest keep the simple questions coming. I don't mind simple questions at all. That's just fine with me. No, I'm teasing, obviously, whatever questions you have. This is one, you know, the classic diplomatic answer to anything is, it depends. And this is one in which it depends. The role of the diplomat varies throughout an embassy or consulate. My role is very different from Donald's role. Donald's role is very different from Elizabeth's role. Elizabeth and I work in the exact same office, 20 meters from each other, and she and I have very different roles, although there is a lot of crossover. But the bottom line, at the end of the day, our most important role is really to serve and protect American citizens and business interests. There is really nothing more important to a U.S. diplomat than an American citizen. And that's really why any of us are here as far as consulates and embassies exist. Now, obviously, things have expanded quite a bit, right? So, for me, my everyday role currently is really in visa adjudication. Now, what that means is I help make decisions regarding if somebody should qualify to go to the United States based on immigration, United States immigration law. And that really is my day in and day out. Previous to this position, as I said, I was in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And here's another reason why this answer depends is because even for me, my job's going to be different from each post to each post. So my role is going to depend on what position I have. I'm not going to do my current job in my next position. And after that position, I won't do the same position I'll have then at the next position. So we're all what's called generalists. Donald obviously works in public diplomacy. He engages with local communities, the domestic audience to help them understand U.S. Positions. Elizabeth, her role primarily is engaging with American citizens who often need assistance within Australia. There's management officers, management diplomats who work almost, you probably would never even see them. They work in the consulate and they make sure that we have places to live. They make sure that we have our housing and our movements covered. There's economics officers and political officers who work with businesses and the local government and help relay messages between the domestic government, the United States government, and the host country government. So we do a lot of things, and the answer, it depends, is kind of boring, but that's the truth to it. And I'll toss it over to Donald or Elizabeth in case either of you have anything you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of more things. In addition to those general roles that Lincoln talked about, there's all sorts of really fascinating what we call bureaus within the State Department that you can work in. There's narcotics. Sorry, it's INL, International Narcotics Law
and law enforcement.
And law enforcement. Thank you, Donald. And if you work in that bureau, you might be working to reduce the growth of opium crops in different countries around the world. There's the Bureau of Human Rights, Democracy, and Labor, which you can guess what you do in that job. I did a tour in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. So that's the State Department has its own bureau that liaises with the rest of the intelligence agencies in the United States. And we do a lot of work to, share what we learn through our diplomats with the rest of the intelligence agencies. There's tons of stuff. I have a friend who worked on the Arctic Council. So there's a Council of Nations that have a presence up in the Arctic, and they have a permanent staff, and she was on that permanent staff for a couple of years. So there's a lot of really fascinating roles beyond just those, what we would think of for us as usual things, like doing visas overseas or public affairs or political reporting.
Thank you all for that one. We'll just go into our final pre-submitted question. Again, this one will go to anyone. Victoria has recently joined the Belt and Road Initiative. How might this affect US and Australian trade relations?
Oh, I'll take a crack at that. So first of all, we're the US diplomatic mission to Australia. It's not our business to dabble into state affairs. So whether Victoria chooses to do something, whether New South Wales, Northern Territories, any area, subset of Australia, that's an Australian domestic issue. I wouldn't expect Ambassador Synadinos to worry about, you know, Nebraska's relation with Canada. He's got bigger fish to fry. That said, let's talk a little bit about the Belt and Road Initiative. One thing that often doesn't come across as clearly as it should be is that the United States has no problem whatsoever with China investing in infrastructure projects in other countries. That is not a problem. And in fact, we applaud China when they do a good investment in an infrastructure project that includes transparency, where the country or locality that's engaging with them knows exactly what the deal is, where there haven't been backhand, as some people refer to them, commissions paid to people to get the deal done, and where it's not going to lumber a community with a port or an airport or a road that is substandard and for which the next 3 generations of that country are going to have to pay the bills. So as far as, you know, international competition for infrastructure programs and partnerships, that's not a problem at all. We would just encourage any country or any government that signs up for the Belt and Road Initiative, that they look at the fine print and find out exactly what they're signing up for, and make sure that the deal is going to follow rule of law, that they have the capacity to follow up legally if things don't work out the way that they wanted to, and that they're not lumbered with something that looks good on the surface and isn't going to actually deliver what their community needs.
Thank you for that one. And on that note, I think we will turn over to live questions from anyone. So if anyone has a question, just type in the Q&A box or raise your hand and I will allow you to talk, and then you can unmute yourself and provide your question. So first up, we've got Brianna. Bri, I will allow you to talk if you want to unmute yourself to then ask the question.
Hi, I had a question about, since you've all had like varying careers in diplomacy, I had a question about if you've noticed any trends in the practice of diplomacy, whether that's in the US or whether that's worldwide or in other countries that you've worked in.
Thank you, Bri.
I see Lincoln rubbing his chin there. I think as far as trends, now remember, I think I'm probably the longest in tooth in this career, just by a couple of years. But, you know, trying to spot trends over just the 15, 16 years that I've been in the Foreign Service is probably too short of a time. But some of the real differences in how diplomacy is practiced that I've seen even in just the 15 years is through the immediacy of communications. So for instance, what we're doing right now, you know, it used to be you were assigned to be a consul or an ambassador or a staffer at an embassy. You literally got on a slow boat and you went out to your country and you represented the United States. And every so often a ship would come with some telegrams for you to read with your guidance, but you made decisions and that was it. You spoke for the US government. Now, because of the ease of communications, you're literally going back to Washington. Or when I worked at UNESCO at a UN body, all the countries referred to it as, I'm going to have to go back to Capitol to get clearance on that. It's good in that you get the word straight from the Home Office. It really sucks in that your hands are tied until you get the word back from the Home Office. I would literally be in debates at UNESCO, so that's the UN Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization in Paris. I would literally be sitting in the executive board room with the 58 members of the executive board of UNESCO with a nice little placard of the United States of America in front of me, and we'd be debating a resolution. And I would be sitting there with this on my lap, waiting for the WhatsApp message to come from Washington to tell me whether I could vote yes or no. Or or I'd be sending a WhatsApp to somebody on my desk back in Washington saying, country X just said A, B, and C. What do we think of that? and be getting responses back in real time. And I think that really has changed. I won't swear that it's changed for the better, but I think it's changed the way that we do at least that part of our job. I'm sure, Elizabeth, your part of the job, technology has changed in a huge way.
Yeah, certainly for consular work, the internet has made our jobs both, it allows us to do a better job, but it also makes it a little bit more complicated. Luckily, I never had to do this, but I've heard tales of having to get out microfiche to check like a list of names of people who aren't allowed to get visas. And you'd have to physically get out microfiche, put it in a machine and scan for a name. Now we have computers, we click a button, it runs that search for us. And there is still, a human review process for that, and that's why we're there. But yeah, consular work is very much a internet-based thing now, and that is a big change from probably not the last 10 years, but definitely from about 20 years ago. And I think Donald is right, like just the speed and also the accessibility of information means that if you say something that creates news, it's going to be around the world in moments. And so that has created, I think, a lot better message discipline is what we might call it from Washington, where we get instructions in the forms of talking points to use. We get for certain topics, we get requests to make a presentation to the host government on a certain issue and ask for their support in a certain way. But what that also means is that we are in a stronger position because we do have that unified voice that we're speaking with around the world. There's no confusion about where we stand. And so I think that's a positive from all that.
Lincoln, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? I saw you. No, everything's said? Too easy. Well, next is Chelsea. I'll allow you to talk, and if you want to ask your question. And thanks to Bree as well for giving such a quick, short question that had so much potential. Thank you.
Hey, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to know what you all think the biggest challenges of your job would be on a personal level as well as professional, especially in the area of getting your family to travel with you, and has that put any difficulties on personal lives?
Thank you, Chelsea.
I can hop in here. So yeah, it is. First of all, thanks for the question. It's a great question, particularly for anybody who's serious about getting involved in this profession, because it really is an important component of life in the Foreign Service. So a bit of background, I'm married, I've got two, rambunctious, sweet little kids. And so anytime, we move from one place to another, we are constantly trying to figure out how to best coordinate a variety of things. We're thinking about school years, and when we're going from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere and back, that really is a factor that you need to consider. Are you pulling your kid out of school midway through? Are you going to set them back half a year? Are you going to push them forward half a year? And that's just one thing. You're dealing with and trying to find new family doctors every couple of years, right? You're trying to, you're making friends who you think, this is going to be my friend for the rest of my life, but I might not see you again for 10 to 15 years, right? And one of the things that is nice is we do have internet and a multitude of means of keeping in contact with one another, but it's a little bit harder when you're a little kid, right? And you don't, my 5-year-old isn't walking around with an iPad or an iPhone, tweeting or on Instagram, right? So but I have to remind myself that just because she's a little kid, the friendships and the relationships she's making are not any less meaningful than the ones that I'm making as an adult. They mean the world to her, right? So it is difficult. And my wife and I are in constant discussion about, all right, is this what we're going to do for the next 15 years? Are we going to pull the plug on this? And right now, the lifestyle is working for us. It's really the only lifestyle that our daughters have known. And they get a real sense of pride when they talk about the countries they've been to and the different, sort of iconic locations that they've seen. And for right now, at least they tell my wife and I that they enjoy it. My eldest daughter, who is 9, she is starting to get to the point where she's like, we have to move again. I'm going to miss my friends. I'm going to start over again. And it is a real concern. But the thing about the Foreign Service, right, the thing about being a diplomat is it's not the U.S. military. It's, like I can walk away if I feel like, my time is done. It's time for me to move on to something else. This is no longer working for my family and I can walk away. I'm not under any extended contract to where I've, given up. I promised 10 years of my life or something like that. So that's a nice thing to have in the back of our pocket. And frankly, as long as this lifestyle keeps being fulfilling, and we feel like, my wife and I feel like the kids are still getting more out of this than they would otherwise, and ditto for my wife and I, then we'll continue to do it. But it can be a real hassle. It can be a real pain.
And I'll just jump in because it looks like Daniel has asked a follow-up to this question, saying what kind of support do you get for when you move, moving your family, moving allowance, accommodation, putting kids in school. We get, basically the State Department will move our stuff when we move. They don't move our furniture because they found out it's cheaper to just keep the furniture where it is and we just use the furniture that's there. So very interestingly, whenever you go to a new place, you have the same couch and the same dining room table and like everything, you'll have the same lamps even. So that's one sort of comedic thing that we have in the State Department. And they'll move your stuff. So you can move like the pictures you put on the wall and obviously your clothes and things like that. So you get to make where you're living your own. And in addition to that shipment, which can take months and months, they'll also send a smaller allowance of things so that you can sort of set up your home while you're waiting for that stuff to arrive on usually a slow boat to wherever it is. Just for different places around the world, it can take anywhere from a month to maybe 6 months more for your stuff to get there. So you learn sort of what is essential for you to have when you move. And it is a challenge. Lincoln mentioned a lot of the challenges, and I'll just add, finding someone who can cut your hair properly is a really big challenge. And it always takes a few tries when you move somewhere new. The least of any of the challenges that Lincoln mentioned, but something that's there nonetheless.
And personally, I'm just happy to have hair. So, but that's more of a personal challenge than a professional.
Look, just one other thing to add is, I mean, this sort of profession is just, I mean, it's all about flexibility. I mean, on the personal side. So, look, my family and I, we were supposed to be back in the USA right now. Our tour, unfortunately, was scheduled to end a couple weeks ago in Sydney. But as everybody here knows, travel arrangements have changed globally. And so my family and I, we don't actually know specifically when we'll be leaving Sydney, but it's likely in the next couple months. And that's just part of the deal. So I just want to throw out there, flexibility is an absolutely essential component to maintaining any sort of happiness in this lifestyle.
Thank you for those ones. Donald, you didn't have anything you wanted to add?
No, I'm good right now.
All right. Well, Andrew, I'll allow you to talk, and if you want to ask a question.
Sure. Sorry, my headphones just died on me there. Sorry about that. Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, cool. Just guys looking at the screen a little bit. Firstly, I would like to say thank you to Donald because you mentioned before that about the USS Ronald Reagan being outside Brisbane. I actually got a chance to go see it. I absolutely loved it. Absolutely amazing experience, and I'm really thankful for that. So my question is, my own experience is I've joined a bunch of different university clubs. I've been involved in a bunch of organizations. I've even just recently got the chance to go over and spend some time in Japan. I was just wondering what is some career advice you would give someone like me and other people who want to get into becoming a diplomat, because I personally don't think that my experiences are adequate in becoming a diplomat as of yet. What advice could you give me to potentially become a diplomat afterwards?
Thank you for that one, Andrew.
Yeah, Elizabeth, go ahead. I see you.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, I'll just tell you a little bit about my background before the Foreign Service, which is that I actually studied classics in university, which I studied Latin and ancient Greek and archaeology and art history and literature and stuff from the ancient world, which I have not used that subject matter basically at all in my job, you know? I mentioned the really diverse backgrounds of different people in the Foreign Service. And I think like people have been asking in the chat, like what kind of skills do you need to be a diplomat? Even though the subject matter I learned with my classics degree, I don't use now, I use a lot of the skills I learned there. So being able to read and evaluate or take in and evaluate different sources of information, synthesizing that into really clear written materials, changing the way I communicate based on the people I'm talking to or the form it's taking, that kind of communication stuff that you can learn from a lot of different humanities type courses, I think is really important to being a diplomat. I think somebody asked in the chat, you know, what's the most important thing? And Donald said willingness to learn and to synthesize information. And I think that's really true. Being able to take in a lot of information, evaluate it, and act on it appropriately. That is, you know, 90% of what we do every day. So don't feel like, oh, I don't have enough international experience or I haven't taken all the right courses or whatever. There are a lot of different things that different people can bring to the table.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Elizabeth has said. When I joined the Foreign Service, they do a little survey of all the people that are going to be in your orientation class, and just looking at the range of experiences, we had people who had been a provost at a university. We had retired military officers. One of my colleagues, her immediate previous job before joining the U.S. Foreign Service was a projectionist at a movie theater. And she's one of the smartest women I know and has an advanced degree, but it just happened to be that was the job she could get at the time. And our system, as Elizabeth outlined earlier, is so different from everybody else's. You know, we do not go to Harvard and pluck their top 5 graduates. You know, we all take the same tests. We all enter the same way. So it's a little bit more open than a lot of other services. Liam, I'm going to hijack for just a second here, if you don't mind, because I notice we've got about 15 minutes left, and there's sort of an elephant in the room, and Courtney brought it up in the Q&A panel. And Courtney said she's having trouble, says she has lots of kids in her house and doesn't want to talk. So she wanted to ask how major political events impact diplomatic work, such as the current protests in both Australia and the United States. She said, or just in general. Let me start out by saying that I, speaking for myself, am absolutely appalled by what I'm watching in the United States right now. It's so frightening to see what has happened what happened to George Floyd and what has happened in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And I say murder because the police officer who had his knee on his neck has been charged with murder. I'm absolutely appalled by what I'm seeing. I'm also enthusiastic about what I'm seeing, because what I'm seeing is hundreds of thousands of Americans getting out into the street and telling their government to change. telling their government at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, that change has to happen. And one of the things that I'm gratified about the United States and the way we operate is that we have our messy family arguments right out in public. And sometimes that makes my job hard, because my job is to explain the United States to foreign audiences. And I always want to put the most positive light on what's going on. I can tell you that in 2015, I ran a big program in Paris, because this was the 50th anniversary of the march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama. The Freedom Marchers were there, and they were marching for voting rights and for equal rights and civil liberty. The marchers were stopped by the police on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It's a very famous photo of the police stopping them. Tear gas was used. The year before, a police officer named Bull Connor had used fire hoses on freedom marchers in Birmingham, Alabama. Horrific images of what was happening there in 1964. Really bad, shameful stuff. And in 2015, I, as a US diplomat, was using those images and those stories to talk about the United States and to talk about civil unrest and what happens, what people do when they take the streets and how they move the government. Now, we have not got there, you know, and I'm not going to try to quote Martin Luther King Jr., but to paraphrase him, you know, we haven't reached the end of that struggle yet. But we see it going on, and we see progress, and we should celebrate, just as we need to condemn every bad act, and I mean every bad act, we need to celebrate the good action. We need to celebrate when our professional sports leagues open their eyes and say that an athlete taking a knee during the national anthem was a political statement. It wasn't an anti-American statement, it was an anti-racism statement. And so I celebrate the progress that I hope will come out of this. And I hope that somebody who's sitting in our consulate in Sydney, and I hope it doesn't take 50 years, I hope it's in 5 years, can sit there and use these images from this week to illustrate American activism and how it is actually inspiring people around the world to ask these questions. So sorry for doing a little sermon there, but I just feel like, yeah, that's a really important issue this week, and it's not something that we should ignore or be shy about.
No, it's all right. Lincoln or Elizabeth, do you have anything you wanted to add?
I'll add one thing. I don't think I can say it much better than Donald in terms of what it means for our work externally, but I do want to speak about what it means to us internally. Like, we go to work, we are a workforce that has equal employment opportunities required. It's written into the law. We've got an Office of Civil Rights within the State Department that makes sure that people are not discriminated against on a bunch of different bases, including race. But when we see this kind of stuff going on, we have to look at the root causes and examine how we're operating as a State Department, as a consulate, as an office within the consulate. And those discussions have been going on all last week and this week. You don't see those, and you're not going to see those, because a lot of it is people sort of processing things internally. But just know that, you know, this is something that I think I feel very confident saying personally, every single diplomat at our consulate has felt this personally, and wants to know and act on what they can do to make it better.
Thank you for that. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and I'm actually going to steal the show and ask one of my questions, which does very much relate to what Donald was talking about, and that's, how has your consumption of media changed since living internationally?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. And remember, I'm longer in the Foreign Service and older than either of my counterparts, and much older than most of this audience. So for me, when I was a university student, it was the local paper and going to the library and finding a copy of the Times of London or a copy of the New York Times or the Washington Post. It was a lot harder to get the international news. But since living overseas, one of the things, and Elizabeth and Lincoln, you tell me if the same holds true for you, I find myself sort of obsessed with the news out of every country where I've served. So actually reading the news takes a longer time because now I want to find out, are they doing marches in Paris? And which streets are they going down? And what is the Brazilian government saying about what's going on right now? So it ends up taking you a little bit more time. I have found with the internet and with digital media, I've become much more suspicious of the news, and I don't mean this in any cliched fake news commentary. I just mean I look at so many different sources now, and I see the editorial content that comes into the news coverage, and even from the best sources. And so I try to purposefully make myself read, I'll just be blunt, left wing and right wing and center news. So in my office, I have a television, and I often am flicking around between Sky, ABC, Channel 7, and then I'll flick over to a couple of the American networks and watch the news. And sometimes you get whiplash. If I watch an hour of CNN and an hour of Fox News in the same day, I have to wear a neck brace because it just goes from here to here. So I think that's the important thing, is to look for that diversity of sources. You guys, do you follow Saudi news, Lincoln?
Yeah, I do, actually. I've been in a drought the last couple of weeks just because the headlines, my attention's been back home more than abroad recently. But without a doubt, and it's like you said, it's because I spent enough time there and I was engaged in the Saudi domestic news cycle in one way, shape, or another. Ditto Bulgaria. Anytime I see a headline about Bulgaria, I'm always investing my time in it. Same thing with Haiti. It's inevitable. It becomes part of your daily process. And you brush your teeth, you put on socks, you check the news. And on the one hand, it drives my wife and kids crazy. We have an absolutely no phone policy at the dinner table, right? But otherwise, it can be a really addictive thing. And that's not necessarily a good thing, right? That's one of the problems with the advancement of technologies, is being able to put it down. But following the news is an essential component of our position. It's just we have to have some ideas of what's going on in the world, at least of what's being reported in abroad as well.
Elizabeth, did you have anything you wanted to add for that one? No? Well, we've got about 5 minutes left, so we'll ask one last question, but it has to be really quick. Matt, I'll allow you to talk.
Oh, thank you very much. Just to build up on the news sources, especially as international relations students, we check a lot of that in the mornings. What will be your favorite news sources that you usually check to get a spectrum of like the different things that are happening around the world?
Thank you.
Well, since my day starts with the news every day, I'll tell you that and part of my responsibility is to inform my boss, the Consul General, about what's in the news. My focus first thing in the morning is what is Australian media saying, and particularly if they're saying anything about the United States or American companies or anything related directly to us. I usually start the morning on news.com.au, and then I flick on the television, and I usually start with a little bit of ABC. So I watch Mike Rowland and Lisa for a little while, then I'll jump over to one of the commercial stations. I don't get Sky at home, so I can't watch that at home. And so I flick around a couple of the commercial stations. While I'm watching TV, I'm on my laptop going from the Sydney Morning Herald to the Telegraph to the Australian. And then I'll also look at the Courier out of Brisbane to see what's happening up in Queensland. And then as I'm walking into work, I put in the earbuds and usually just for the hell of it, listen to 2GB as I walk in the morning. So that gives me a pretty wide range of Australian coverage. Then when I get a little bit more time later in the day, I might look at some of the American coverage and some of the wider reporting. And as soon as I get to work, I will have a set of news clips that are provided for me that use an algorithm to get all the top stories for me. And then later in the day, I'll get something from Washington with what they think are the top stories. So it's a little bit of a, you know, drinking by fire hose as far as the news is concerned.
I'll just say Donald probably has the most comprehensive news diet of any of us. Like you said, good part of his job is, you know, part of it is having to read the newspaper and stuff. Mine is not quite so varied nor quite so deep, but I do try to get a variety of sources, both domestic stuff in the US and Australian sources as well.
Yeah, Lincoln, you agree with that? Well, on that note, I think we might wrap things up. Thank you for attending, and thank you for everyone for coming along. We had a massive turnout. When we first started planning this, I didn't think we would get over 50 attendees. And don't forget to stick around for just a bit afterwards. There is a survey you can fill out.
And can I just say thanks to everyone for participating, and thanks to Elizabeth, Lincoln, and Liam for joining me, and to Catherine, who none of you can see, but who's in the background making all of this work. Really appreciate you all giving us a moment to talk. If you have other networks, other groups that you think would be interested in one of these events in the future, we're trying to get this up to about a monthly frequency of doing this, and it'll be a range of different diplomats from the consulate joining for future events. And I do have one trivia question for you, and you can throw it into the chat box very quickly. Are any of you aware that every year the United States has a big ministerial meeting called OSMEN that happens? Because we're totally obsessed with this, and we assume that if we're obsessed with it, you are. And I'm just really curious as to whether the general Australian public knows that every year your foreign minister and your defense minister get together with our Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense for a raucous day of bilateral meetings, because I have a feeling that we're a little bit more obsessed with this than the rest of the world. So if you let us know if you've heard of it, and if you're following the news on that, that tells me how much I need to concentrate my efforts on it. Yep, there you go. Never heard of it? Nope, never knew. Okay, keep sending those in. You're going to help validate my suspicion. All right, thanks everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Everyone.
Thanks for
you,
coming.
Liam. Thank you, Donald. Thanks, guys.